Today we're going to be talking about adjusting your photograph to create a better painting. And that, like anything else, has to be done in terms of practice. If you're working on a painting for a show or a gallery or to give as a present, it's not a time to try things. So for all these things we're doing, if we think of them more as exercises, so when I look at a reference, I can put it in Photoshop or something else where I can adjust the composition, zoom in and crop it, maybe do small 3x4, 3x5 inch little color studies. Just like the thumbnail where we try and find the shadow pattern with pencil, we can do the same thing with color. Just rework the large areas. 3x5 might be a hair too small, but not much, maybe 5x7. A lot of times I'll do it on just paper, on a sketchbook, because all I'm doing is adjusting the color on those 6 to 8 large shapes. No detail, strictly to see what I can do with color that makes it look better than the photograph. And I can adjust the light by changing the values a little bit, adjust the temperature, creating more depth and more sense of shadow, and also mess with the composition. Today we're going to be talking about improving or making adjustments with the photograph when you paint or before you start painting. And typically, if you can make changes in a reference first, whether it's through a thumbnail drawing with just color notes. When I look at this photograph, I could do a little thumbnail that simplifies the dark pattern, typical thumbnail drawing before we get started, and just make color notes. Like back here, I want this more bluish green, this more blue violet, this more, just things like that that simplify things. Notes like you're going to get rid of all these little shrubbery in here that just destroy the composition because it's just too busy. Maybe stronger sunlight on the grass. Darks don't need to be darker, but you can always increase the contrast between the light flat plane and a darker vertical plane, just to create more contrast and the sense of sunlight. Simplifying these trees here. When I look at these trees right here, there's not that strong of a simple dark and light pattern. It's very busy, very textury, does not have a strong sense of just dark and light. So I made some changes here. My interest is, probably right in, where am I? Right here, right in there. So I can get rid of quite a bit, get rid of a little bit everywhere. And that helps me zoom in, makes a better composition. This is more of a square, which I think would work pretty good. But you can see I got rid of all the small little bushes and trees in the background hills and back in here, and just a simple bluish green, a dark, to make these lights pop out. And then as I go back, I get lighter. This is lighter. When you add white to this, it gets grayer. White always grays colors. So to come up with something like this, probably the effect of adding a little more of the complement for back in here, and then just more blue and a little bit of white back in there. So I'm gradually getting a little lighter, bluer, despite what the photograph gives me. A good idea is to do a little small, this is a square, might do a 5-inch by 5-inch little color study where I kind of plan out the colors I'm going to use. But you can see I've increased the contrast of lighter lights down here. I came up with 3 or 4 different colors. Some of it's more this winter grass that's more yellow. You get a lot of ideas from the original photograph. I see a couple of different colors of grass here. I can carry that same thing over my painting. I got a lighter and a little bit darker, and that helps break up the color. Then I got the winter grass here, maybe 2 values each here and here. A little bit stronger yellow-green here, but all the flat planes are brighter. The road's brighter. It's probably a bit too bright. I'd probably maybe keep it more at this value. Even the color on the shed, the barn here, which is kind of the focal point area. More of a muted, somewhat warm violets. Pretty strong color. That does not look like a photograph. It looks like paint, or in this case, digital paint, but nonetheless. While I like this, I see that, I don't want to copy those colors. I like the values, but color-wise, I want to increase the colors. I'm going to have it more violet. And even the trailer here is trying to turn it into more of a horse trailer to make it a little more aesthetically pleasing than just an RV. Then using the foreground, the shrubbery here pulling you into the fence, and the fence pulls you back down here to the focal point. Everything kind of does that in this photograph. It leads you to the focal point, even the kind of the lines of the trees here. So think through the photograph, how you can improve it compositionally, but also value-wise. How can I increase the contrast, especially if it's a sunlit day? And then color-wise. And the biggie is simplifying. I simplified the shrubbery and trees on the hillside, all this foliage on these trees. All the trees and shrubbery were simplified by just simple dark and light shapes. Vary in the shape or the size. I've got this tree here a little bit bigger than this and this one. They're all the same size in the original photograph. So really think through how to change things. Make notes, do a thumbnail, do a small color sketch. And the color sketch, the only purpose is to kind of work out colors of big areas, not detail. So don't get caught up in detail with the color sketch. This is somewhere in Wyoming. Obviously what I'm interested in here is the kind of this area where you have a lot of strong light and shadow, foreground shadows, background sunlight. The way the sun and shadow hit the trees, and then the corral and barn here. So if I crop this first, and it's with a phone, so it's not a great image, but there's enough information there to work with something. There's a lot of good dark and light shapes. Composition is good. I would probably cut down on this white fence a little bit. Maybe have it go back this way and not as big and prominent. You know, I could get just a few railings in there. The fence in the foreground here just takes up too much. Too many little darks and lights, too many little shapes and values. So I want to just simplify it. I 1 to 2 rails instead of 3, and maybe thin the fence down instead of having it so big and so light. It's the lightest thing in the photograph. So I'll probably make it just a darker fence. Whereas do whatever it takes to make things work. Now, color-wise, this would be more of a color change because I kind of like the composition, aside from changing the face. So fence. But color-wise, I want to punch the color a little bit, especially in the sunlight. This is too gray. I don't want a gray color. I want a cool color. It'll be muted, but it'll definitely be a blue or blue-violet, so it has a bit more punch. Same thing with these lights here. I want more color variation and stronger color. And get a lot of blues and violets in the shadow. I'd probably block it in with a blue-green, but then have a lot of red, violet scrubbed around in it, just for the sake of making it cooler. So changes I made here. First, getting that background hill a lot bluer, has more punch to it color-wise. Having the trees here more of a yellow-orange. Having a little bit lighter, a little bit darker light, and then a couple of values, or 3 values actually in the shadow. And overall, a little bit darker, and then the darkest accents. So 2 or 3 values in the dark and a couple of values in the light to show some variation. Same thing in the greens back in here. I want to have about 3 values in 2 different colors. One of the colors I just add white to, but this is more of an orange green. A lot of red or orange in it that makes it a lot more muted, but more of a late summer green, and then a stronger yellow green up in here. So varying it quite a bit. And when you're adding color to, in this case in the background, more blue to make it recede back and have a bit more punch, adding violets into the blue-green shadows, I'm not adding them to render anything. They're just spots of color, and they can just read as spots of color because it is a painting. We're not trying to change the photograph. We're not trying to add something that I have to render. We're just punching the color, and it can be just color for color's sake. You know, I could have a spot of violet like this, or here. I'd probably want to pull it or push it into wet paint so it loses its edges a little bit. Darker violet over here. I've got a light blue violet scrubbed around into the blue-green here in the foreground. In other words, I would have the blue-green field as a one overall large shape of color, and then lightly scrub in some violet just to cool it off a little bit. So color for color's sake. Same thing with the shadows on these greens, like in this green tree here. The green works good for photograph, but for paint, I might want to pop it a little bit. A little more blue, tiny bit of cad yellow, and maybe some viridian, just to make it a little bit stronger, but still having the 2 values, the lighter dark and darker dark, to create some depth in there. So push the color. If your composition doesn't need any changing or adjusting, color usually does. And don't forget to maybe work it out ahead of time. Now this one is also in Wyoming. I really like the composition. I like the You know, the river kind of winds you back in here, and I want to find a way to kind of pull it back this way so the eye is carried throughout the composition. But there is sunlight coming this way and hitting the building there, here. Strip of sunlight here, maybe a little bit there, there's some there. It was getting cloudy, so I was losing that sunlight. But now I can re-emphasize it. So I want to emphasize the sunlight more contrast, maybe warm up the sky. Sky's too washed out. Camera, this is again the camera phone. It's towards the end of the trip where, you know, my stick and my camera is full, so I have to resort to the phone. But the water value here is too close to the value of the sky, so I need to make the water darker. And maybe some of these shadow areas, real light white buildings that are in shadow, I can make them just a bit darker. It's not white, it's more of an orange, but still needs to be darker. So these are the changes. A little more color in the sky. This color here is what's left from the photograph. I just broke it up with some stronger blue. So you have some shapes of clouds and shapes of blue sky. And then again, simplifying is the biggest thing we always change. So I'm simplifying the trees that I see here, which look too busy, individual like fingers sticking up on those trees. Now, I don't have to paint it just the way I did here. I just use the lights here to follow the form and try and vary the shape. I could use different shapes for that, but I want to simplify it, whatever I do. So I simplified it. I've got a darker shadow, well, a little lighter shadow than the photograph, but it's darker than this. I made this more blue and got this darker than here. So I'm trying to set up my values, in other words, darkest, next darkest, then the lightest way in the background. And I want to get those all set up. And then simplified the lights on the trees here. And these are probably too light now that I look at it. This looks more sunlit. These would be in shadow. This tree here would be in shadow. These trees would be catching sunlight. So I would get a blue-green that's darker and cooler, a little darker. This is sunlight back in here, so this has to be a little bit darker. Be more like that. And I'm throwing in spots of color here, like this orange, just to vary the green. And this is early September, so you're starting to see a little bit of fall color. And then a little bit darker in some areas on the edges, just to keep it in the shadow. It has to be in the shadow. Well, there is some sunlight there too, so I take that back. I was thinking more shadow area, sunlit area. But either way, I want to simplify. Simplify the foreground by creating these strong light colors, these strips of light in here and here, and then a little bit of violet in the shadow. And a little bit darker right next to the sunlit strip of sunlight there, just to create more contrast. And don't forget that the lighter the value, the thicker the paint. And you can also see in the water, I darkened the water up quite a bit. I just got a little bit of violet and glazed over it. If this was a dry painting, I would get a blue alizarin, add a lot of medium to it, and put it over this to darken it. I wouldn't have to repaint the whole thing. I could still have all the little value changes. Even though in the painting I wouldn't want this many. But a thin glaze, transparent glaze, that's darker will darken the whole water and still have all the detail in it. And again, I wouldn't have this much detail in the water, but some. So again, increasing that suggestion of light and distance by pushing things bluer in the background and simplifying, especially those trees, and separating values more. So a couple of examples here. I think all these are by Hansen put off. But you can see color-wise, things are pushed quite a bit. Real strong orange, yellow-orange, kind of a red-orange up here, and real strong blue, blue-violet in the shadows. That's not photographic color. So he's not copying the photograph or even copying what he sees outside, because he painted a lot outside. The shadow colors aren't pushed all that much, but they're definitely cooler than the light. And it's that contrast of warm and cool that makes that work real well. This is another Hansen put off. It's not a very good image, so I can't blow it up very good. But you can see how he's pushing the color here. Real strong, warm colors for this sunlit area. Cool colors in here. He doesn't push the contrast very much. Could have gone darker here to get more value contrast. But that temperature contrast really suggests shadow and sunlight. So get out of your comfort zone of copying the photograph and use colors that improve the sense of sunlight. Even these violets, I have to admit, I wouldn't have the courage to go this strong
on these violets back in here, but I really like this painting. While I tend to push color more now than I used to, I'd still like to push it more, with the idea of having color harmony and having some muted colors in there to make the stronger colors work better. It's another Hansen put off. You can see how blue he gets back in here to show the depth. And then the shadows are gradually getting a little warmer as they come forward. But the color's pushed quite a bit, and a lot of contrast between the flat light areas and the vertical dark areas. So don't hesitate to push contrast and push color. This also, the real strong yellow greens back in here, oranges, yellows, and then the real strong blue. Then a warm, looks like a cerulean blue or a manganese blue up in there. But violet, blue violet, and then a kind of a manganese or cerulean blue. Real strong color, but he's thinking in terms of pushing it to suggest sunlight. Now his shadows here are not very dark, but they are really cool compared to that. So don't hesitate to push color and change composition and push contrast to get more of the effect of what you want, kind of improving on the photograph.